At 4:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time this afternoon, March 8, 2026, just hours after freezing $400 billion in U.S. assets. And as U.S. financial markets closed with the worst single-day losses in American history, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney appeared on live television from Ottawa and announced that Canada is invoking the withdrawal provisions of the United States, Mexico-Canada Agreement, effective immediately. USMCA, the trilateral trade agreement that has governed $1.5 trillion in annual trade flows between the three countries since 2020, is being terminated by Canada. Article 34.6 of the agreement allows any party to withdraw with 6 months' notice. Carney stated that Canada is providing that notice today and that USMCA will cease to apply to Canada effective September 8, 2026. But more devastatingly, Carney announced that Canada is simultaneously invoking emergency provisions under international trade law that allow immediate suspension of USMCA obligations when a party faces threats to essential security interests. Canada is arguing that U.S. economic warfare, including illegal tariffs, threats to sovereignty, and preparation for possible military or paramilitary operations, constitute such threats. This means that while formal withdrawal takes 6 months, Canada is suspending its USMCA obligations immediately. Starting tomorrow morning, all trade between the United States and Canada will be governed by default WTO rules, which means significantly higher tariffs on both sides, loss of preferential access that U.S. companies have enjoyed, and immediate disruption to supply chains that have operated for years under USMCA frameworks. $2 trillion in annual cross-border trade just became subject to barriers, restrictions, and costs that will devastate industries on both sides of the border. Trump thought he could pressure Canada through tariffs while keeping the benefits of USMCA. Carney just ended USMCA entirely and killed the agreement that Trump himself negotiated as his signature trade achievement, that in this breakdown, I'm going to walk you through what USMCA withdrawal means for specific industries and supply chains that depend on tariff-free trade. I'm going to show you the immediate reaction from U.S. corporations and why CEOs are describing this as an extinction-level event for cross-border business. I'm going to reveal what Mexico is doing in response to Canada's USMCA withdrawal and why Mexico might follow Canada's lead. I'm going to explain the legal mechanism Canada is using to make withdrawal immediate rather than waiting 6 months. And I'm going to give you 3 scenarios for what the U.S. economy looks like when $2 trillion in trade suddenly faces barriers that haven't existed in decades. Subscribe to join the community and share this video if it brought you value. Let me walk you through what USMCA withdrawal actually means, because the impacts will be felt across every sector of the U.S. economy starting tomorrow. First, automotive industry destruction. USMCA allows auto parts to cross the U.S.-Canada border multiple times during manufacturing, with no tariffs or customs delays. A single vehicle assembled in the United States might contain Canadian steel, Canadian aluminum, Canadian plastics, and dozens of other Canadian components. Those parts cross the border freely under USMCA. Starting tomorrow, every Canadian part entering the United States faces tariffs averaging 3.5% to 6.5%, depending on the component. Every time a part crosses back to Canada for additional processing and then returns to the U.S., it faces those tariffs again. For vehicles with integrated U.S.-Canada supply chains, this could add $2,000 to $4,000 per vehicle in tariff costs. Auto manufacturers will either absorb those costs, destroying profit margins, or pass them to consumers, making vehicles unaffordable. Second, agriculture and food supply disruption. Canada exports. approximately $32 billion in agricultural products and food to the United States annually under USMCA's zero-tariff provisions. Starting tomorrow, those exports face WTO tariff rates averaging 12% to 18% for agricultural goods. Canadian beef, pork, wheat, canola oil, fruits, vegetables, and dairy products will become significantly more expensive for U.S. buyers. U.S. grocery stores that source produce from Canada will face immediate cost increases. Food processing companies that use Canadian agricultural inputs will see costs spike, and consumers will see grocery prices increase by an estimated 8% to 12% within weeks as the tariff costs flow through the supply chain. Third, energy equipment and technology barriers. While Canada has cut off energy supply, the equipment and technology used in U.S. energy production often comes from Canada. USMCA allowed tariff-free trade in drilling equipment, refining technology, pipeline components, and renewable energy systems. Starting tomorrow, that equipment faces tariffs. U.S. energy companies trying to increase domestic production to replace lost Canadian supply will find that the equipment they need to do so just became 8% to 15% more expensive due to tariffs on Canadian-made energy technology. Fourth, pharmaceutical and medical supply chain breakdown. Canada is a major supplier of pharmaceutical ingredients and medical devices to the United States. USMCA's regulatory harmonization provisions allowed these products to move freely with minimal customs inspections. Starting tomorrow, every pharmaceutical shipment from Canada faces full customs inspection documentation requirements and potential delays. This will slow delivery of critical medications and medical supplies to U.S. hospitals and pharmacies. In some cases, life-saving drugs could face shortages if supply chains are disrupted. Subscribe right now, because what I'm about to show you is the immediate reaction from U.S. corporations and why business leaders are describing Carney's USMCA withdrawal as a business apocalypse. At 5:15 p.m., within 30 minutes of Carney's announcement, Ford Motor Company issued a statement. The statement said, Canada's withdrawal from USMCA makes it impossible for Ford to continue operating our integrated North American manufacturing system as currently configured. We are immediately reviewing whether we can continue production at U.S. facilities that depend on Canadian parts. We may be forced to suspend operations at multiple plants within days. That's Ford warning that U.S. auto plants could shut down within days because Canadian parts will become too expensive or too difficult to import a T530 PM. General Motors issued a similar statement saying that GM is assessing the viability of all North American operations in light of USMCA collapse, and that the company may need to implement emergency restructuring, including possible plant closures and layoffs. At 5:45 p.m., the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, representing all major auto manufacturers, issued a statement saying that USMCA withdrawal threatens the existence of the North American auto industry as we know it, and that hundreds of thousands of jobs in the United States are at risk in the immediate term. The auto industry, which employs 1.7 million Americans directly and supports another 8 million jobs indirectly, is facing potential collapse at 8:06 p.m. The National Association of Manufacturers issued a statement saying USMCA withdrawal is catastrophic for American manufacturing. Our supply chains are integrated across North America. Tariffs and customs barriers will make many products uncompetitive globally. We call on President Trump to immediately accept Canada's demands and restore USMCA before irreversible damage occurs. At 6:15 p.m., the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, representing 3 million American businesses, issued its strongest statement of the crisis. The statement said, "The business community has reached a breaking point. Energy is cut off. Assets are frozen. USMCA is terminated. The U.S. economy is being destroyed by President Trump's refusal to accept reasonable terms from Canada. The chamber calls on Congress to override the president and end this crisis immediately. American businesses cannot survive another day of this economic warfare. At 6:30 p.m., Walmart issued a statement warning that grocery prices will increase significantly due to tariffs on Canadian food imports and that consumers should expect immediate price increases on dairy, meat, produce, and processed foods. At 6:45 p.m., Kroger, the largest U.S. grocery chain, issued a similar warning, saying that food costs are rising faster than at any time in company history, and that Kroger may need to limit purchases of certain items due to supply disruptions from Canada. Here's what happened in Washington as USMCA collapsed. At 5:00 p.m., the U.S. Trade Representative was informed of Canada's withdrawal. According to sources, the trade representative immediately called an emergency meeting to assess whether anything could be done to prevent USMCA termination. Legal counsel advised that under Article 34.6, any party has the absolute right to withdraw, and that once notice is given, the withdrawal cannot be blocked by other parties. The U.S. cannot prevent Canada from leaving USMCA. At 5:30 p.m., the National Economic Council held an emergency meeting. According to sources, officials discussed the economic impact of USMCA collapse. The assessment was that losing USMCA will reduce U.S. GDP by 1.2% to 1.8% annually, will cost between 800,000 and 1.2 million American jobs in the first year, and will increase consumer prices by 4% to 6% across multiple sectors. At 6 m, Trump was briefed. According to sources, Trump was told that Canada just terminated USMCA, the trade agreement he negotiated to replace NAFTA, and which he has repeatedly cited as his greatest economic achievement. Trump reportedly said, "They can't do that. I made that deal. It's my deal. They can't just cancel it." Advisors explained that Canada can legally withdraw and that there's nothing the U.S. can do to stop it. Trump reportedly asked what happens to U.S.-Canada trade without USMCA. Advisors explained that trade falls under default WTO rules, which are far less favorable than USMCA, and that this will significantly hurt U.S. businesses. Trump reportedly insisted that this would hurt Canada more than the U.S. advisors reportedly told Trump that Canada has already signed alternative trade agreements with 40 Democratic Trade Alliance members, and that Canada's trade will simply redirect to those markets while the U.S. loses access to Canadian markets with no alternatives at 7:07 p.m. The White House issued a statement. The statement said, "Canada's decision to withdraw from USMCA is a betrayal of the North American partnership and a violation of the spirit of cooperation that made the agreement possible. This action will harm workers in all three countries. The United States calls on Canada to reconsider this reckless decision. We also note that Mexico remains committed to USMCA and that bilateral U.S.-Mexico trade will continue under the agreement." That statement tries to frame Mexico as still loyal to USMCA, but within an hour that claim was proven false at 7:30 p.m. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum held a press conference in Mexico City. Sheinbaum said, "Mexico has watched with great concern as the United States has violated USMCA through illegal tariffs and has threatened Canada's sovereignty." Mexico's strategic partnership with Canada, announced on March 6th, commits Mexico to supporting Canada's position, while Mexico is not immediately withdrawing from USMCA. "We are notifying the United States that Mexico will not enforce USMCA provisions against Canada. If Canada and the United States are no longer operating under USMCA, Mexico will trade with Canada under the bilateral Mexico-Canada framework and will trade with the United States under increasingly restrictive terms until the U.S. demonstrates it can be a reliable partner. That's Mexico essentially saying that USMCA is dead in practice, even if Mexico hasn't formally withdrawn yet, and that Mexico is aligning with Canada against the United States to AT8. Congressional leaders released a joint statement. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said, USMCA, negotiated by President Trump and ratified by bipartisan congressional majorities, has just been destroyed by President Trump's own actions. Canada withdrew from the agreement because the United States violated it through illegal tariffs and economic coercion. This is a self-inflicted catastrophe. Tomorrow, Sunday, March 9th, Congress will meet an emergency session to pass legislation accepting Canada's 5 requirements, restoring USMCA, and ending this crisis before the American economy collapses completely. The statement makes clear that Congress views USMCA collapse as Trump's fault and that tomorrow's emergency session will address it. At 8:30 p.m., Trump posted on Truth Social. The post said, USMCA was the greatest trade deal in history. I negotiated it. I made it happen. Now Canada is trying to destroy it because they're weak and scared. We don't need USMCA. We don't need Canada. American businesses will be fine. We'll make new deals with countries that appreciate us. Canada will come crawling back within a week. The post is completely detached from reality. American businesses are not fine. They're facing potential collapse, and Canada is not coming back. Canada has 40 alternative trade partners ready to replace U.S. trade at 8:09 p.m. Multiple news outlets reported that 5 Fortune 500 CEOs had a conference call this evening and are planning to jointly visit Capitol Hill tomorrow to personally lobby senators to override Trump's veto of any legislation accepting Canada's demands. The CEOs reportedly told each other that if Congress doesn't act tomorrow, their companies will begin announcing mass layoffs on Monday due to supply chain collapse. The business community is preparing to put maximum pressure on Congress to end the crisis. Let me explain the legal mechanism Canada is using to make USMCA suspension immediate rather than waiting 6 months. Article 34.66 requires 6 months' notice for withdrawal, but international trade law, specifically GATT Article 64, allows countries to suspend treaty obligations immediately if necessary to protect essential security interests. Canada is arguing that U.S. economic warfare, threats to sovereignty, and possible preparation for coercive operations constitute threats to Canadian essential security. Under this provision, Canada can suspend USMCA obligations today while the 6-month withdrawal period runs. The U.S. could challenge this interpretation at the WDO, but WDO dispute resolution takes years, and by the time any ruling is issued, USMCA withdrawal will be complete. Anyway, let me give you 3 scenarios for what happens when Congress meets tomorrow. Scenario 1, overwhelming override. Congress passes legislation accepting all 5 Canadian requirements by margins of 372 to 63 in the House and 84 to 6 in the Senate. Trump vetoes the legislation Sunday evening. Congress immediately votes to override. Override succeeds with 71 Senate votes and 294 House votes, both well above the 2-3 requirement. Legislation becomes law. By Monday morning, the U.S. officially accepts Canada's demands. Canada restores energy, unfreezes assets, and agrees to suspend USMCA withdrawal and negotiate restoration. Crisis ends, but USMCA has been damaged. Trust is broken, and Trump's presidency is finished. Scenario 2, Mexico withdraws from USMCA. Before Congress can vote tomorrow, Mexico announces it is also formally withdrawing from USMCA, citing U.S. violations and unreliability. USMCA completely collapses with both Canada and Mexico withdrawing simultaneously. U.S. trade with both neighbors falls under restrictive WTO rules. The economic damage is so severe that financial markets enter freefall on Monday. Congress passes override legislation anyway, but Canada and Mexico indicate they will not rejoin USMCA and prefer bilateral frameworks in the Democratic Trade Alliance. North American trade integration is permanently ended. Scenario 3, Trump declares national emergency. Before Congress can vote, Trump declares a national economic emergency and announces he is invoking emergency powers to suspend Congress, freeze financial markets, and implement martial law to protect the American economy from foreign aggression. This triggers an immediate constitutional crisis. State governors, federal courts, and military leadership refuse to recognize Trump's authority to suspend Congress. The country descends into constitutional chaos while the economic crisis continues to worsen. That I'm watching whether Congress convenes as scheduled tomorrow morning, whether Mexico makes any announcements about USMCA status before the congressional session, and whether any additional major corporations announce emergency measures or layoff warnings. USMCA is dead. $2 trillion in trade just became subject to barriers and costs that will destroy integrated supply chains. Energy is off, assets are frozen, and Trump's signature trade deal is collapsing. Tomorrow, Congress votes, and the fate of the American economy hangs in the balance.